This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ACEA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This year, their annual conference, with the theme of Flourishing Animals, will be held online between the 30th of November and the 2nd of December. The call for papers closes on the 15th of September. Do take a look on the ACEA website for more details. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. One of the really nice things about this series is that the books, even though they're academic texts, are actually quite affordable. Indeed, one of them is completely open access, so you can read it for free online. That's Fighting Nature, Travelling Menageries, Animal Acts and War Shows by Peter Tate. I encourage all listeners to have a look at that book and others in the series. Now, I met today's guest at this year's British Animal Studies Network paper series. The theme of the online events was violence, and you can actually watch recordings of the papers online. I was speaking about hate speech in animals, and today's guest spoke about pigeons in warfare. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr Justyna Włodarczyk. Justyna is an assistant professor and the department head in the Department of North American Cultures and Literatures at the University of Warsaw in Poland. Her work covers animal studies and women writers with a focus on North American culture and literature from the 19th century to present. Today, we're going to talk about her book Genealogy of Obedience, Reading North American Dog Training Literature, 1850s to 2000s, which was published in 2018. The book is volume 20 in Brill's Human Animal Studies series. Welcome to the podcast, Justyna.
Welcome, Josh. Thank you for having me.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to work on this topic?
The work on the history of dog training is very closely linked to my private life, to the fact that for all my life I have been involved with dogs. And I was one of those crazy dog girls. Now I'm a crazy dog lady, a label that I wear with pride. And as it happens, many of the people, and I mean largely non-academics here that I interact with, are also dog people. And for a long time, I've had the desire to probe what drives people's interactions with their dogs, how this has changed over time. And I've trained dogs, and I still continue to train dogs. So training loomed as a kind of more structured area of human-animal interaction than just like interaction itself. So I thought, okay, not just interaction, but a particular area, training. And it was an area that I was familiar with from the get-go. At least I knew what stories people from the dog training community tell themselves now, how they explain why they do what they do, what conflicts exist, how the training communities differ from one another, those kinds of things. And during my long involvement with the dog training community, I was able to identify a broad shift in the training practices and thought about how this shift reflects changing understandings of like both the human-canine relationship, but also bigger changes in culture in general. For example, changes in child-rearing practices, etc. However, dog trainers seemed somewhat ignorant of the complexities of the history of dog training. And interestingly, kind of the way that it works among dog trainers, many contemporary dog trainers, is they tend to think about a before and after narrative of dog training. So there is a kind of before positive reinforcement period, the dark ages of dog training, and then this after positive reinforcement, the new face of dog training narrative. And I was sure that there was much more to this story. And basically, that's why I decided to investigate and to just read these really old books about dog training and see what emerges from that.
Yes, well, let's start with that too simple reading, because I think that's what I imagined in my head if I was to think about the history of dog training. And I'm sure that's what a lot of listeners might imagine as well. that once upon a time we had very brutal training methods, and these became gradually gentler. If I understand correctly, you see that as much too simple.
Yes, I do. Well, one thing that this narrative kind of obliterates is the variety of training methods that existed, and the fact that there was a range of training methods. My book starts in the 19th century, in the 1850s, and that happens, by the way, because this is the period in time when the kind of like popular handbook market flourishes in North America. So many books are published, many books are read, and this is why we have many sources from that period. But generally, the kind of sources that people tend to remember are those that are very harsh. And the reason why these are remembered has to do with the fact that we somehow want to, or we dog trainers, that's the we that I'm using right now, but maybe I shouldn't be. But anyway, we kind of want this division. It kind of makes our life easier in many ways, right? We are the positive ones, they, the middle-aged, medieval trainers, were the cruel ones. But that's not the case. If you read into these books, you will see that actually the 1850s books really do talk about, well, first of all, that there is a range of methods, but secondly, that almost all of the books talk about the need for being calm and being gentle, that there is a lot of talk about the way to the dog's heart, finding the way to the dog's heart, that there is a lot of talk about persuasion, gentleness, and that is opposed to brute force. And in terms of like the methods that dog trainers use nowadays, well, I actually even found a few, not many, but a few books that use the kind of methods that contemporary positive reinforcement trainers would say, oh, wow, I mean, that's quite modern. That's what I would use. So that range did exist already in the 1850s, although I admit that definitely in terms of kind of like the predominance, definitely more punishment-based methods were used.
Now, you explore these training methods over a wide period of history, and I'd love to dip into some of these periods and talk about some of the really interesting things that you address in the book. But I think it's worth also mentioning that this is a genealogy of dog training.
Yes.
And I know you say that this is a book of animal studies and not a book of theory, but you are drawing quite strongly upon Foucault. So could I ask what you mean by genealogy in this context and why you think that genealogy is a useful tool for exploring this issue?
Yes, of course. The most obvious kind of Foucauldian term that can be, or that is often tied to dog training, is discipline. I mean, we kind of think of training dogs as disciplining dogs. And of course, Foucault speaks of discipline in a kind of a different understanding. Foucault, as many of the listeners I assume probably know, thinks of discipline as all the techniques that go into the making of a docile body. So all of the techniques that focus on the body itself with the goal of creating a certain efficient behavior. And of course, these were, when Foucault wrote, he was thinking of humans, but this is, of course, something that can be applied to dog training as well. Now, what we begin to see, or rather, like the main idea, the main shift, this big shift that I talk about in the book, is the shift away from discipline. So, in other words, the earlier methods, I am generalizing here a bit, but I do have to generalize to kind of have this argument out there. So the earlier methods do focus on the body, on making the dog's body conform. So the sit exercise would be taught by pressing on the dog's rear end and making the dog sit, while the more modern methods, the more contemporary methods, focus more on affecting the dog's mind. So in other words, making the dog want to perform a behavior and not simply having them perform the behavior out of habit. And of course, it's kind of like this big shift away from disciplinarity and towards what I call biopolitics, but it's biopolitics in a very particular type of Foucauldian understanding, the kind of positive reading of biopolitics, not purely biopower, but a shaping of desire, not just a disciplinary control of the body. That's the shift that I focus on, and this is why I also have Foucault kind of in the title here, because it is his framework that does guide my argument. And I want to see how we got to where we are. So how we got to this idea that influencing the dog's will, the dog's desire to perform certain behaviors, to be with us, to act in particular ways, is that the dominant paradigm for contemporary dog trainers.
I was very struck by your discussion of the entanglements of dog training and slavery in the 19th century, or specifically 19th century America. And this made me think both of the need for specificity in genealogical projects. So, for example, slavery and race relations can operate in quite different ways in non-US contexts. But it also made me think of the continued racial dynamics in conversations about dangerous dogs, like ongoing arguments about so-called breed-specific legislation. So this is a two-part question, I suppose. Could you tell us a little bit more about the entanglements between dog training and slavery in the United States context? And do you think that those entanglements are related to the continued entanglements between dog training discourses and racial discourses?
Oh, this is a wonderful long question that that requires a long answer. Yes. So it is fascinating how a topic such as dog training can be entangled with these huge stories of race, racial oppression, discrimination, and so on. And in terms of the 19th century, what I write about in the book is I write about hunting dogs, and generally these two styles of hunting with dogs. One that was popular among the kind of landed, rich, wealthy white people who in the South, it so happened, were also often slave owners. And they hunted with dogs often, of course. These were not subsistence hunters. The hunt was a certain kind of a spectacle. By the way, Gary Marvin writes about hunting as a spectacle in the context of fox hunting in England in an absolutely wonderful way. And then, of course, we had the subsistence hunters. And the subsistence hunters in the South were often slaves. So these slaves also had dogs and used their dogs to help themselves survive, to basically, get the food that they needed. And in fact, when laws against the ownership of dogs by slaves were introduced in Virginia in the second half of the 1850s, what happened was basically this would really make slaves' survival even more difficult because they needed those dogs to help themselves, to help live, to help survive. And then, of course, we also had the third type of dog, and this is the kind of dog that also appears and kind of is tied to racial relations in the US so strongly: slave hunting dogs. So we had the slaves who had their own dogs that the whites, by the way, made fun of as unrefined, and even the styles of hunting that the slaves practiced were seen as crude and unrefined. We had the whites hunting dogs. These were mostly bird dogs, pointers, setters, that hunted in ways that were considered to be stylish, sophisticated, refined. And then we had the dogs that were used for the hunting of slaves. And these dogs were basically trained to follow the scent of a human being and then to attack that human being. And of course, we see reverberations of this in imagery that is connected to the civil rights movement and to the struggle of African Americans kind of throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. So, for example, during the civil rights movement, the images of the police setting their dogs on peaceful protesters, African American protesters, were images that really changed people's outlook on the civil rights movement, that basically made them support civil rights much more. And of course, these are still images that we know, and these are narratives that are still quite popular. By the way, again, another wonderful book on the kind of intersections of dogs and race in the US is Bénédicte Boisseron's Afro Dog, which is a very recent book, I think maybe 2019 or 2020. And in it, she talks a lot about how police dogs have been used against the African American community to kind of police the racial struggle. However, you also mentioned the dangerous breeds issue and the connection of certain, well, first of all, the stereotyping of certain breeds as dangerous, and secondly, the connection of those particular breeds to the African American community in order, in a way, to strengthen, or rather the result of this connection is to strengthen both the perception of those dogs as dangerous and the perception of African Americans as somehow animal-like, to dehumanize them. And interestingly, kind of like when you really dig into these documents, when you dig into the stories of these breeds, it becomes fascinating how this has turned around, how this has changed. So in other words, the pit bulls that we now associate with illegal dog fighting, and we also see them, or that they are largely seen as dogs that are kept by African Americans, that they did not absolutely originate this way, that pit bulls were considered to be wonderful family dogs by white families, although interestingly Irish immigrants to a certain extent, and as we know at the time, end of the 19th century, they were not considered to be fully white, so still a kind of marginalized group. But anyway, the deal here is that the story of the pit bull is such that they go from being associated with being a good family dog to being a horrible fighting dog. And somehow this shift is tied also with the kind of race change that they undergo. So they go from being a white people's dog to being a black person's dog. And again, the pit bull issue is beautifully explored by Harlan Weaver in, I forget now, but because there's a book now. There used to be just an article, Cultures of Dog Fighting, but there's also a new book out by Harlan Weaver on the topic.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I feel like we could spend our whole episode talking about just that period of history and those entanglements. But there were a few other things as well. I mean, this is a very rich, long book with lots of detail. A few other things that I thought were worth picking out. So one of them was a fascinating historical episode, which might be completely unknown to many listeners, that you explore, which is the Dogs for Defence campaign. So could you introduce us to that and explain its significance in the history of dog training?
Yes, in terms of significance in the history of dog training, it's actually not that significant. It is rather more significant maybe in the history of the human-canine relationship in general. In terms of training, that was actually quite a big failure. That is, many of those dogs did not succeed in being trained for the tasks that were set before them. But yes, so the backdrop there is that the US was kind of late in beginning a campaign for the training of dogs for military purposes. So Europe started around World War I, and the US did not have a program for the training of military dogs during World War I or after World War I. So they, when World War II broke out, they decided they needed dogs for the army. And how do we get dogs for the army? The answer was to create a kind of open a campaign which urged people to donate their pet dogs, their family pet dogs, to the army and have them trained as army dogs, as military dogs. And people, in fact, responded to the call by donating their family pets. And as I have said, in fact, many of those dogs were not trained successfully and never went on to serve as army dogs, but still this idea that you can take a family pet and kind of give it training or send it to boot camp and turn it into a soldier, turn the dog into a soldier, itself tells us something about, well, not just World War II, but about how patriotism in a way worked at the time in the US. People really wanted to help, and they would do anything to help the war effort, and they saw donating their family pet as a kind of sacrifice that had to be made on behalf of their country. Interestingly, though, there was also a project of retraining the dogs back for civilian life. And many of the dogs that kind of either came back or just did not make the cut and were never sent to fight were retrained, and they were later returned to their families. And this really, what it tells us is it tells us that the belief in the power of training that this program kind of was rooted in was amazingly strong. Because within the history of dog training, there is, of course, this tension between nature and nurture. So between how much of what the dog can do, we can ask the dog to do, we can teach the dog to do, is nature, so how much is in the dog, and how much is nurture, right? How can we change the dog's behavior? To what extent we can change the dog's behavior? And here, clearly, there was a belief that you can take the family pet. So that nurture is 100%, that not only can training change this animal from a family pet into a war machine, and then it can be trained, the dog can be trained back. The dog can be turned back into being a family pet. But as I said, basically, it was a failure. And it turned out that the training techniques that they used were quite miserable, and many of the dogs failed.
It's particularly interesting that the dogs were returned to a domestic setting afterwards, given the context that even today, a lot of militaries, a lot of police forces are quite reluctant to retire their dogs back to a domestic setting, saying that they're unsuitable for a domestic setting.
Yes, indeed. This is, that like retirement for service dogs, police dogs, military dogs is another big issue. And whether this is really the case, it's hard for me to say, whether this is really the case, that can we retrain the dog? Can we return them to a domestic setting? But certainly what we can see on the basis of this kind of popular support for giving these dogs retirement and for treating them as, again, kind of like retired service men and women, what it tells us is of our desire to believe that they deserve this retirement, right? That they are somehow worthy of living their life after this period where they were kind of purpose used is over.
Now, this tension between nature and nurture that you're talking about leads us quite neatly to the issue of breeding, which is a recurring feature in your discussion, the relationship between training and breeding. You put this both in terms of Foucauldian biopolitics and in terms of ideas of eugenics. So I was very struck by your worries about the way that, and this is your word, eugenic attitudes and practices re-emerge with the professionalization of obedience trials, and more recently, the professionalization of a whole range of dog sports.
Well, first of all, eugenic science, and here when I say eugenic science, I am using quotation marks, which of course you cannot see because you can only hear me, but believe me, when I say eugenic science, that's what I mean, was based on ideas of animal breeding. So as it emerged at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, there was already quite a lot of background in animal breeding that took place in the 19th century. And these ideas of improvement, right? A breeder's work is to improve the breed, improve the breeding stock. And in order to do it, one should think in terms of generations, etc. And this is an attitude that was kind of incorporated into eugenic science as it was applied to human beings. However, as it applies to dogs and where it ties into or crisscrosses with dog training, is that in the case of many activities that dogs are trained for, this element of a dog's kind of inborn suitability for a given activity is quite significant. So in the case of hunting dogs, for example, you cannot simply take a dog that is of a kind of non-hunting heritage, that has had those instincts either bred out of them or just doesn't have them because just doesn't have them, end of story, and turn them into a good hunting dog. So an entire project in the breeding of hunting dogs, for example, is that you breed in order to make training easier, right? You shape the dog's genetic potential in a way that will make the job of the trainer easier. Of course, this is problematic on many levels for kind of like the contemporary pet owner, pet guardian. It's also problematic for us as people who are into animal studies for various reasons, largely those that we would like to see animals, and dogs in this case in particular, valued for their individuality, but also kind of like for their canine otherness. We don't want to see them as valued for how good of a result of a breeding program they are. And yet, of course, it happens. And the problem with contemporary dog sports, or rather what I diagnose as a potential problem with contemporary dog sports, is that on the one hand, they arise from people's recognition of canine needs and desires. So the reason why agility became popular is because people saw that dogs like it. Dogs like jumping and running, so we give them a sport that kind of makes it possible for them to satisfy those needs that would not be satisfied in an urban setting. Dogs like retrieving discs, let's give them a frisbee, right? And then their need for activity, for also a kind of intellectual focus is fulfilled. But of course, once these became competitive, what happened is that people also started breeding dogs in ways that would make them suitable for a particular sport. And I am an agility competitor also myself. And what I see right now is that the sport is dominated not just by a particular particular breeds, but also even by particular lines within a particular breed. So people look at a dog and they can say what the dog's breeding is. And of course, as you can imagine, I am not particularly thrilled with that, but I have seen it in other areas of life before. So, in other words, it starts that the contemporary dog sports often begin from an impulse to give the dogs what they need. But once they turn competitive, once they become a sport, once people begin to really care about winning and losing and not just having fun with their dogs, that's unfortunately also the moment when kind of breeding for particular traits comes into focus.
Before we move on to our regular questions, let me ask you what might be quite a difficult question. And that is, to what extent do you think the things you say about dogs and dog training also apply to other kinds of relationships with animals? So, for example, do you think that horse training or pigeon training or even lion training might follow the same kinds of lines and trajectories? Or do you think that dogs are unique in this aspect?
They are and they aren't. Where they are unique is in the fact that they are so easily trained. The dogs are the easiest animal to train. And what this means is that regardless of how crude and shoddy and unscientific your methods are, most likely you will be able to teach your dog to do what you want your dog to do. So, in many ways, these discussions that happen about training methods within the dog community are discussions about human culture and about how we visualize human canine relationships, not about what works and what doesn't, because everything works. So you can teach your dog to sit by pushing on the dog's rear end. You can teach your dog to sit by capturing the sit with a clicker. You can lure the dog with a treat. All of that is going to work. If you're working with another species of an animal, if you're working with a lion, it's not going to be that easy. So try pushing on the lion's rear end. And of course, nothing is, bad things are going to happen. So in other words, that makes training dogs unique. The fact that they are so easily trained and that basically anything you can do will work. But what we can most definitely see the changes in dog training, so this shift from punishment-based methods to reward-based methods, as embedded within broader social changes that, of course, also somehow apply to humans' relationships with other species of animals as well and with the natural environment. So, in other words, somehow the fact that we wish to be kinder, gentler in our relationships with our pet dogs is also tied to the fact that maybe there is a growing desire to ban animal circuses and so on, specifically because they rely on punishment-based methods, but also because, of course, they place the animals in an environment in which they should not be placed. Interestingly, though, let me just add that many of the positive, kind of early positive dog trainers switched from the training. This is like the late 20th century. So when I say early positive trainers, I mean clicker trainers. So they switched from training marine mammals or other species of animals to training dogs. And they applied the same methods that they used for training dolphins at SeaWorld to the training of dogs. And interestingly, they Well, I mean, they were embraced by the dog training community. Well, in the 1990s, they were. I mean, there was a lot of tension within the dog training community in the 1990s and early 2000s about which methods are better and so on. But yes, they were accepted. Also, some of the people who have been very influential for positive reinforcement-based dog trainers were, for example, Marian and Keller Breland, who were the grad students of B.F. Skinner. And later they opted out of academia. After doing their PhDs, they both had PhDs, they opted out of academia and began their own animal training business, kind of monetizing the skills that they learned as Skinner's grad students. And they would train animals, not dogs, but animals, other animals, for like roadside shows and commercials, for H fairs and stuff of the kind. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that yes, the same methods can be used for the training of different species. However, dogs are, of course, special in that they can be trained using a wider variety of methods. You cannot teach a dolphin to jump through a hoop by simply, I don't know, tying a rope to the dolphin and then dragging them through the hoop. That's not going to work. You cannot teach a chicken to play ping pong also through these kind of crude methods of pressing and pulling and pushing. That's not going to work either. But our desire to train dogs in a positive way is also often tied to our desire to kind of our understanding of this broader shift in humans' relations to animals.
Now, Justyna, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, Donna Haraway's Companion Species Manifesto. This was a game changer for me. And I understand that some animal studies scholars would not necessarily consider this to be pro-animal, but at the time when I encountered Haraway's work, which is when it was published, it just was, for me, a mind blower.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, and here I do have to tell this story. It's a funny story. So for a while, I was not sure that I wanted to enter animal studies as a kind of field, as a subfield. And at the time, I was teaching agility, and I had a student who was a recent PhD in sociology, and he encouraged me to do it. And he said he himself was working on a volume about dogs in Poland and asked me to contribute. And I did. And not only did I end up contributing, I ended up co-editing the volume with him. And this was published in 2014 in Polish, and the title translates as A Dog's Life, Dogs and Humans in Contemporary Poland. And we included pieces on dogs in contemporary art, literature, human-canine interactions, dog parks, and a lengthy introduction that tried to theorize the changes in Poles' relationships to dogs.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
It would be Jane Desmond from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And Jane published a book titled Staging Tourism in 1999. And the book had one chapter on performances involving animals, and specifically on marine mammal performances at SeaWorld. This is a really great chapter which talks about how these staged performances reflect the dominant notion of what counts as natural. And I honestly recommend Jane's work. I think it kind of doesn't get enough credit. And I later contacted her and stayed at the University of Illinois for a year while working on this book. So this is both kind of like an intellectual connection and a personal connection.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Well, however strange it sounds, talk to people. That would be engage with the general public, translate what we do and what we research into language that's non-academic, and not antagonize those who could be our potential opponents.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
This is a very broad question. It's a bit too broad for me, so I want to just narrow it down to talking about dogs. So I hope I can answer in relation to dogs only. And I would want these relationships, human-canine relationships, to be based in respect for the canine's uniqueness, animality, and in a desire for the dog's psychological and physical welfare. So the human wants the dog's welfare.
What is it you're working on next?
I have received some grant funding for assembling a bigger team of researchers, including 2 PhD students and a postdoc, to work on a theme called Figurations of Interspecies Harmony. And this theme is rather broad, But the point is to probe different cultural representations of what counts and has counted as harmonious interspecies coexistence. And this kind of flows from the project on dog training, in that you see the trainers, regardless of the methods they used, thought of themselves as kind of increasing or encouraging human-canine harmony. And it's what they considered to be a harmonious relationship that has differed, or that actually still continues to differ when you think of contemporary dog training. So what do we consider desirable? What do we consider harmonious, ideal? And why? Those are the kinds of questions that I'm going to be focusing on.
And how can people find out more about your work?
Well, I have a relatively updated ResearchGate profile where I upload everything that I can, and I try to make my work open access if possible. This has not been possible with my book, by the way. I can also be contacted by email and usually respond promptly and share whatever research I can share.
Well, thanks, Justyna, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast where you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.